Hey, good afternoon, class. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Miss Criselfi David, your OLC in the subject Purposive Communication. So, as of last week, we had discussed Module 6 to 9A, which is about local and global communication in the multicultural setting. So, for today's discussion, we'll have Module 6 to 9B, which is about evaluating text, reflecting different cultures. So with the next slide, we would have the topics that we need to cover for today or that we need to tackle for today. As you could see, guys, there are four topics or there are four subject matter that need to be discussed for today. For the first one, we have definition of text. So we're going to define what these texts are. We're not only going to define them, of course, aside from defining them, we're also going to explain what texts are. In addition, we're also going to discuss what cultural texts are. So for the third part of the discussion, I'm going to give you sample text, and your task is to identify the purpose of each text. For the last part of the discussion, it's the different types of text that we need to discuss. We have four types. First would be persuasive, followed by instructive, and then we have informative. For the last one, we'll have descriptive text. And we're going to discuss the set types in detail as the discussion progresses. So let us check. Now that you know the coverage of today's discussion, it's time for us to move on to the next slide. So for the next slide, what we have is the introduction. And as you could see, with the introduction, we had defined the term or the terminology text. Allow me to read the provided definition. A text is not limited to something written down. So I want you to remember that. I want you to change your notion and your perception about text. When we say text, they are not just limited to the learning and reading materials you read. When we say text, they do not just simply refer to the books and to the textbooks, magazines, and newspapers you read. But when we say text, they go beyond that. So these are not just the books you read, these are not just the text you write, these are not just the notes you write, because when we say text, they go beyond that. So let us discuss the definition further. A text can be a film, an artifact, anything in a language and culture that conveys meaning. So when we say text, I really want you to widen your horizon because these are not just the text you read and these are not just the text that you write. When we say text, they could also be films. Aside from films, they could also be artifacts. And any object that you see around you, actually, most of the objects you see around you could also be considered text. As long as these objects, as long as these things convey meaning, if they convey meaning, if they relay meaning, if they convey cultural and historical meaning, then they are considered to be text. So for instance, the chairs that you have at home, we know that these chairs could not really talk, they could not really speak, but although they could not really talk and they could not really speak, they in return still they relay a message. Like if you saw a chair, you know that that it is meant to sit on, that a chair is giving you the message that you could always sit on it or you could always sit it on, stuff like that. So it's a thing, it's an object, yes, but aside from it being an object and aside from it being a thing, it could represent something else. It could relay meaning. We know that it's an object. Since it's an object, we know that it's a non-living thing and that it could not speak for itself. But although it could not speak for itself, although we just consider it a non-living thing and an object, at the end of the day, it has the ability to relay meaning and it has the ability to convey meaning. I'll repeat, guys, most of the things and most of the objects you see around you are considered to be text. They are considered to be text because they have the ability to relay and to convey meaning. Now, you might ask me in return, ma'am, is that really possible? Could films really act as text? Could they really be regarded as text? How about artifacts? Could they also be considered text? Could we also consider artifacts as text? The answer is a firm yes. And the answer is a definite yes. So let me explain to you how come films are considered text. Most probably, most of you had watched the movie Crazy Beautiful You by Katrine and Daniel Padilla. And you know, if you had watched the said movie already, you know that the said movie, it's just not about the love story between Daniel and Katrine, and it's not just about the love story that goes between them, but the movie also talks about the culture. It also talks about the cultural practices, the cultural belief of Aitas. And as we know, Aitas are considered to be one of the indigenous groups in the country and one of the tribunal communities in the country. So it shows the movie is not just about the love story between Katrine and Daniel, but it also talks about something else. It also discusses something else. It also talks about the culture. It also talks about the norms and the traditions of the Aitas. And that makes the film not just a film, and that makes the movie not just a movie by itself, but it also stands for something else because it also discusses about the culture of Aitas. And since it also discusses, or since the movie itself also discuss the culture of Aitas, their norms and their traditions, that makes the film a text. Because aside from the love story of the two, it also talks about the culture of Aitas. And because of that, the said film is not just a film, but it could also act as a text. It's all because it conveys cultural meaning. How about artifacts? How could artifacts be text? How come we are also considering artifacts text? But before answering that, let us first define what artifacts are. Artifacts are human-made and human-designed objects, and we could use these objects in order for us to understand people. We could also use such objects in order for us to understand the culture of these people. And just like the text, artifacts they also have the ability, just like the text, artifacts could also relay meaning. They could also convey meaning. And since they could also convey meaning, they are also being regarded as text. Artifacts may come in different types. We have cultural text. We have we have cultural artifacts, should I say. Aside from cultural artifacts, we also have social artifacts, media which includes films, digital films, movies, photos, pictures, photograph, paintings. So these are all examples, digital paintings. So these are all examples of artifacts, and they do fall under media. So aside from media, as mentioned earlier, we also have cultural texts, and these are the antiques you have at home, antiquities, relics. Aside from relics, fossils, which fossils which have been discovered by anthropologists, they are also considered to be examples of cultural texts. So if we have cultural texts, we also have social, or if we have cultural artifacts, we also have social artifacts. And when it comes to social artifacts, we have clothing, the clothes that we are wearing, the food that we are eating, and mode of transportation like jeepneys. It's only in the Philippines that you could see jeepneys. So therefore, it's part of our culture, and this jeepneys also talk about our culture as a Filipino. So they are known to be social artifacts. Now let us try to prove how come artifacts are really being considered as text. So let us go to clothing. So aside from food, clothing is also an example of an artifact, and to be exact, we call it a social artifact. And you know, guys, when we talk of one's clothing, it could communicate many ideas. It could communicate many meaning. We're talking of the way you dress, and we are also talking of the way you carry that dress. And it speaks something about you. The way you carry the dress, the type of clothes that you are wearing also speaks something about you. When we say clothing, it could really communicate many ideas to other people. One would be, it could be a representation of your position in the society, your status quo in the society, your social status. Like if a certain individual, if the said individual, or if the said individuals, let's make it plural, if the said individuals are wearing laboratory gowns, if they are wearing laboratory gowns, white gowns, then you jump to conclusion that these individuals are medical practitioners, that they are doctors maybe, nurses maybe, med tech, medical technologists, radiologists, rad techs, or even chemists, or even dentists. So they are medical practitioners. It's because we know that most of the medical practitioners do wear white gowns. They do wear laboratory gowns. So see, your clothing, the type of clothes you wear speaks something about you. So it talks about your social position in the society. It talks about your social status, and it talks about your status quo in the society. So aside from that, what else? The way you dress, it could also talks about your personality and your creativity as an individual. They say what matters most is not really the brand. It's not the brand that matters at the end of the day. What matters most is the way you carry the dress. So that has something to do with your creativity. So it's just from ukay-ukay, it's just from RTW, but although it's just from RTW, what is important is that how you carry it. So it just costs 20 pesos, but then again, since you know how to carry the dress, you really look good in it. So that is a reflection of how creative you are, and that could also serve as a reflection of your personality. And you know what, guys, your clothing, it could also talks about not only about your personality and creativity, but it could also be a reflection, it could also be a representation of your attitude and your behavior. Like, are you that too liberated? Are you that too conservative? So if you are not that too liberated and too conservative, then you fall in between. You fall in between the two. It means with that you are moderate. So what is trendy nowadays? It's the crop top that is trendy nowadays. So if you wear that kind of clothes, like if you also like the backless style, and if you also like the spaghetti strap and the miniskirts, if this is the style that you like as of today, then somewhat you are liberated. But on the other way around, on the contrary, if what you are wearing are long skirts, and then you are also trying to protect the most sensitive part of your body, you are trying to cover the most sensitive part of your body, with that, you are being conservative. And if you fall in between the two, then you are known to be moderate. Aside from that, when we say clothing, aside from the fact that it could talks about your actions and your behaviors or even attitude, it could also be a reflection of one's age. We are living in a conservative country. So since we are living in a conservative country, when you dress, you have to dress appropriately. Not only that, when you dress, you also have to dress according to your age. Because if you're not really going to dress according to your age, and if you're not really going to dress in accordance with your age, then tendency is that you would really be criticized, and you would really be ridiculed by other people and by other individuals. If you don't really want that to happen, you know what to do. You have to dress according to your age, and you really have to dress appropriately. Aside from one's clothing, the adornments that you're wearing, the adornments that you are having in your body, the accessories and the jewelries that you are wearing, they also speak something about you. Like engagement rings and wedding rings, these are not just objects, these are not just rings, but they also stand for something else. Like engagement rings and wedding rings, they represent marriage. They also represent matrimony. So aside from the fact that they represent marriage and matrimony, they also they could also be a reflection of union between relay. So we are talking of artifacts, and as mentioned earlier, these artifacts could be considered text because they also relay meaning and that they also convey meaning. And now we are discussing adornments, jewelries, and accessories, which are examples of artifacts, and such artifacts really convey meaning. So, for instance, engagement rings and wedding rings. So, what do they convey? What meaning do they convey? What meaning do they relay? They represent marriage. They also represent matrimony, and they also represent union between two people in the name of love. So, guys, now you are having the realizations that artifacts could also be considered text and that they could also be regarded as text because just like text, they also relay meaning. So let's move on to the next part of the discussion. For the next part of the discussion, what we have are cultural texts. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to define what cultural texts are, and aside from defining them, we're also going to discuss them at the same time. So allow me to read to provide a definition for cultural text. Cultural texts are those objects, actions, and behaviors that reveal cultural meaning. So when we say cultural text, they could also be objects. Aside from objects, they could also be actions and behaviors. For instance, when it comes to objects, we have crucifix, we have cross, and as we know, the said objects, both of them, they symbolize and they represent Christian faith, and that they also symbolize Christianity. So they are not just objects because aside from them being an object, they also represent something else. They also stand for something else. A crucifix may mean Christian faith, and then a cross may also mean Christianity. Actions and behaviors, just like objects, they could also be considered cultural texts. Like when we talk to the elders, we have to say po and opo, and at the same time, we also have to bless. In showing respect to the elders, we really have to say po and opo, and we also have to bless to them at the same time. And we know that such actions are part of our culture as Filipino, in paying respect and in showing respect to the elders, we really have to say po and opo, and at the same time, we also have to bless to them. So, guys, even the actions that we are making, the behaviors that we are displaying, they could also be considered cultural text because they also relate meaning. Even the spaces that you are observing, like for instance in the classroom, if it's face-to-face class, if it's face-to-face classes, if we are having the classroom set up, you know that the space in front of the classroom is meant for teachers, educators, instructors, and professors. And that is the reason why you don't even dare to occupy the space in front, and you also do not dare to use the teacher's chair and the teacher's table because you know that the said space is intended for teachers. You do not dare to use their staff. You do not dare to occupy the space in front of the classroom because as you know, the said space is intended for these teachers and for these educators. So even the spaces that we are having and even the spaces that we are making also connote something. They also relate meaning. So when your girlfriend is sick and tired of your relationship, chances are she would ask for a space, and you are respecting that, and you are also giving it to her if that's what she likes. And you also tend to respect the boundaries of others. You also tend to respect the spaces of others, the territories of others. So see guys, even the spaces, they also stand for something else. They also represent something. So since the spaces that we are making also represent something, we could also consider them cultural text. Even the names of the places, like Manila, from Manila before, it's not being called Manila. From Manila, it's being called Maynilad. So why do we call the city Maynilad? Why do we call it Manila as of today? So when you search for its origin and when you search for its etymology, it means you are trying to search for its historical background. And when you do so, when you are trying to research for the historical background of a certain place, it has something to do with history. So therefore, the act of researching has something to do with the has something to do with the it has something to do with cultural text as well. It has something to do with cultural text as well. It's all because you are trying to search for the historical meaning of the place. And when it comes to Manila, it was named Manila. It's because the riverbanks of Manila before there are a lot of nilad. It means nilad plants flourish in the riverbanks of in the riverbanks of Manila. And nilad is a type of plant. It's actually a flowering shrub. And since the said plants tend to flourish in the riverbanks of Manila, that is why the place Manila is being called Manila. It's because of this. It's because of this plant. So Maynilad before, from Maynilad it became Manila. So even the names of the places in the country are also considered examples of cultural text. And just like what I had mentioned earlier, guys, most of the things or most of the objects you see around you are also considered to be examples of cultural text. Next is sample text and its purpose. This is the third part of the discussion. So for the third part of the discussion, you are given text, and our responsibility or our task is to identify the purpose of the said text. For number one, we have adverts, or which we call as advertisement. An advertisement is written in order to influence someone to buy. Therefore, it is made to persuade. So guys, with the concluding sentence, you could already determine and you could already identify the purpose of the text. And its purpose is to persuade. Advertisements are meant to persuade. So they are trying to persuade us, they are trying to convince, motivate, and encourage us to purchase the products that they are selling. And do not be easily swayed. Do not be easily swayed by these advertisements. TV advertisements, TV commercials, advertisements you hear from radios, billboards. These are examples of media messages. And what will you do with such messages? What will you do with the said messages? You have to scrutinize these messages properly. Why do you need to do that? Why do you need to evaluate, and why do you need to assess these messages? You have to. You have to. It's all because if you're going to evaluate them and if you're going to assess them, then we could avoid what we call agent of misinformation, or we could avoid source of misinformation. You have to check the legitimacy, you have to check the validity, you have to check the reliability of these messages, you have to check their accuracy, you also have to check whether they are true, correct, relevant, and accurate. And how could you do that? You could simply do that by means of assessing and by means of evaluating these messages critically. Like when you shop at Lazada or Shopee, whether it's Shopee, whether it's Lazada, when you are adding items to cart, what do you need to do? You also have to check the legitimacy of the product. How could you do that? You have to rely on the reviews. You have to read the reviews first. With the said reviews, you could certainly say whether the products and whether the items that